My parents skipped my grandfather's funeral. Hours later, they were posting vacation photos from a Hawaiian beach with the caption, "Living our best life." That is when I got a text from my grandfather's phone. "Sweetheart, come to my house right now." When I got there, my heart dropped. Before I tell you what I found when I unlocked his front door, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. My name is Brielle, and I am 32 years old. The rain poured down in sheets at the elite Westview Cemetery in Atlanta, soaking through my black dress and chilling me to the absolute bone. I stood entirely alone beside the open grave of my grandfather Elijah. He was not just a grandfather to me. He was a self-made logistics and real estate billionaire who built his massive empire from absolutely nothing but sheer grit and a brilliantly analytical mind. He was my mentor, my protector, and the only person in my family who ever truly saw my worth. He taught me how to read balance sheets when I was 10 years old, sitting on his lap in his grand mahogany office. He showed me the value of earning every single dollar while the rest of the family simply waited for their monthly allowance. The cemetery was vast and silent except for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the large black umbrellas held by the groundskeepers. They waited patiently, at a respectful distance, giving me a moment to say my final goodbyes to the man who raised me. I looked around the manicured green lawns and the elaborate marble headstones, feeling a crushing weight in my chest. Where were they? Where was my mother Vivian, who spent her entire life parading his hard-earned wealth endlessly around the local country club? Where was my father Charles, who worshipped the ground my mother walked on and never dared to contradict her? Where was my golden child sister Chanel and her incredibly arrogant finance broker husband Preston? They had all promised they were right behind me in the funeral procession. They had looked me in the eyes that very morning, dressed in their custom designer mourning clothes, and sworn they would be here. But the rows of folding chairs set up under the green canopy remained completely empty. There was no eulogy from a grieving daughter. There were no tears from a heartbroken sister. There was just me shivering in the freezing rain, clutching a single white rose. I stepped forward and dropped the flower onto the polished mahogany casket. I whispered a quiet thank you to the man who had taught me everything I knew about integrity and hard work. The groundskeepers began their solemn work, and I turned away, feeling a deep, hollow ache that I thought would consume me entirely. I walked back to my car, my heels sinking deeply into the wet earth. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as my hands shook violently. I needed to understand why they had not come. I needed a reason, an excuse, a flat tire, a medical emergency, anything to justify abandoning the patriarch of our family on the day he was laid to rest. I reached for my phone sitting on the passenger seat and dried my hands on my wool coat. Seeking some kind of comfort, or at least a logical explanation, I opened my phone and tapped on the Instagram application. I thought maybe Chanel had posted a quick update about their delay. Maybe their private car had broken down on the interstate or someone fell ill. Instead, the very first image that popped up on my feed felt like a severe physical blow to my stomach. It was a photo of my mother Vivian, my father Charles, my sister Chanel, and her husband Preston. They were not stuck in Atlanta traffic. They were not dealing with a sudden family emergency. They were standing on a pristine white sand beach in Hawaii. The tropical sun was shining brilliantly behind them. They were all wearing matching designer resort wear, holding colorful tropical drinks garnished with little paper umbrellas and fresh fruit. They had massive, carefree smiles plastered across their faces, looking like they did not have a single care in the world. The caption beneath the photo read, "Living our best life," with 2 palm tree and cocktail emojis. The location was specifically tagged at an exclusive 5-star luxury resort in Maui. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, completely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of their disrespect. My mother had literally skipped her own father's funeral, the very man whose immense wealth funded her extravagant lifestyle, to go sip cocktails on a tropical island. The betrayal washed over me in intense waves of hot, blinding anger. I zoomed in on Preston. He was standing there with his typical smug grin, his arm wrapped possessively around Chanel. Preston was a white finance broker who always looked down on me and my career choices, telling me that auditing was just counting other people's money. He loved to play the role of the elite Wall Street genius saving his in-laws' wealth, and my family absolutely worshipped him for it. They treated him like royalty simply because of his finance pedigree and the high society image he provided for my sister, allowing her to flaunt a lavish lifestyle on social media. He had likely orchestrated this entire trip, convincing my mother that attending a gloomy funeral would be too depressing for her delicate nerves, and that they deserved a spontaneous getaway to cope with their heavy grief. I scrolled through the comments under the photo. Friends from their elite Atlanta church circles. The same women who wore massive hats and judged everyone. Every Sunday were leaving heart comments and telling my mother how brave she was for taking time to heal her spirit. No one knew the true story. No one knew they had left me standing completely alone in the pouring rain to bury the man who had given them absolutely everything. They were putting on a show for their wealthy friends, completely discarding the painful reality of the situation. It was a sick performance designed to hide their ugly truth. I felt sick to my stomach. The audacity to post vacation pictures while the dirt was still being shoveled onto my grandfather's casket was a level of cruelty I had never truly thought them capable of achieving. It made me realize that their greed and selfishness knew absolutely no bounds. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and buried my face in my trembling hands. I screamed in frustration, the sound echoing loudly inside the small confines of my car. How could they do this to him? How could they be so utterly devoid of basic human empathy and respect? I sat in the dark parking lot of the cemetery for what felt like an absolute eternity, listening to the heavy rain beat against the metal roof of my car. The rhythmic sound usually brought me peace, but today it just amplified my crushing isolation. I tried to steady my erratic breathing to push down the overwhelming urge to call my mother and scream until my voice gave out. But I knew exactly how that frustrating conversation would go. She would answer the phone with fake concern, twist my words, call me dramatic, and accuse me of trying to ruin her delicate healing process. She was a master of emotional manipulation, gaslighting me into thinking my very real pain was just an overreaction. I was entirely too exhausted to play her twisted games today. I wiped my wet face, smudging my waterproof makeup, and reached for the ignition, deciding to just go home to my small apartment and sleep for days. I wanted to forget this terrible day ever happened, to turn off my brain and hide from the world. But right as I turned the key, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut right through the quiet drumming of the storm outside. I glanced over, expecting it to be an automated email from work, or maybe a generic condolence message from a distant relative who had heard the news on social media. I picked up the device and looked at the screen. My heart completely stopped. The blood literally froze in my veins, and the air was sucked straight out of my lungs. The text message was from my grandfather's phone number. I stared at the name Elijah on my screen, my mind desperately struggling to process the impossible situation. My grandfather had passed away 4 days ago. I had just watched his heavy casket being lowered into the ground not 20 minutes prior to this exact moment. His phone had been turned off and placed in a secure lockbox by his team of attorneys. There was absolutely no way he could be sending me a message. My fingers trembled so violently I could barely swipe to unlock the screen. I had to wipe the screen twice because my hands were slick with cold rain and nervous sweat. I opened the message thread. The text was short, direct, and chilling. "Sweetheart, come to my house right now." I read the words over and over again, trying to find any logical explanation. Had someone hacked his personal phone to play a cruel prank on me? Had his lawyer turned it on and sent a scheduled message without realizing the horrifying context? But why would it say, "Come to my house right now"? The phrasing was exactly how my grandfather used to speak to me. He always called me sweetheart, and he always demanded my presence with that gentle but firm authority. A deep chill ran down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing rain outside. My grandfather's sprawling estate in Buckhead was supposed to be entirely empty. The lawyers had locked it down pending the official reading of his will later this week. No one was supposed to be there. But someone had sent this message from his personal device, and they were waiting for me. I put the car in drive, my tires spinning slightly on the wet pavement as I peeled out of the cemetery. The profound grief and anger I had been feeling just moments before were suddenly entirely replaced by a surging adrenaline-fueled curiosity. I navigated the slick Atlanta highways heading straight toward the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. The windshield wipers worked frantically to clear the pouring rain, but my mind was moving even faster. As I drove, the deep-seated resentment I held toward my family bubbled to the surface. It had always been this way between us. I was a 32-year-old financial auditor. I spent my long days analyzing spreadsheets, verifying corporate compliance, and finding hidden discrepancies in complex financial records. To my grandfather, my chosen career was a point of immense pride. He respected hard work, transparency, and accountability above all else. But to my mother and sister, my job was a complete embarrassment. They viewed auditing as a tedious, boring profession fit only for the working class. They constantly reminded me that I was failing to elevate the prestigious family name. In our wealthy African-American upper-class circle, appearances were absolutely everything. My mother, Vivian, was utterly obsessed with maintaining the perfect high society facade within the Atlanta elite. She spent her days attending exclusive charity luncheons, networking with the alumni from prestigious universities wearing expensive designer labels, and ensuring everyone in town knew she was the daughter of a prominent billionaire. When my sister Chanel married Preston, my mother acted as if we had won the social lottery. Preston was a white investment broker with a flashy smile, an expensive sports car, and a knack for throwing around complex financial jargon that made my parents swoon. They did not care who Preston actually was as a human being or how he treated people behind closed doors. They only cared about the perceived prestige his presence brought to our family portfolio and how it elevated their status at the country club. They constantly compared me to Chanel, asking when I would stop wasting my valuable time looking at boring spreadsheets and finally secure a wealthy, high-profile husband to secure my future. They told me my financial independence was just a sad cover for my inability to attract a man of real substance. But my grandfather Elijah had always seen right through their shallow obsession with status. He built his empire during a time when men like him had to work 10 times as hard just to get a foot in the door. He used to tell me that wealth meant absolutely nothing without the intelligence to manage it and the integrity to keep it safe from vultures. He warned me countless times that Preston was a fast-talking opportunist who could not be trusted, but my mother adamantly refused to listen to reason. She handed Preston the keys to her social life and trusted his financial advice implicitly, letting him manage accounts she barely understood. I was labeled the black sheep simply because I demanded substance over style. I refused to play their country club games or attend their shallow networking events. I chose to build my own life on a solid foundation of hard, honest work. And because of that choice, they treated me like a total outsider in my own family, isolating me at every opportunity. As I turned onto the private tree-lined street leading to my grandfather's massive estate, my heart pounded against my ribs. The thick canopy of oak trees blocked out what little light remained, making the winding driveway feel like a tunnel into the unknown. The massive iron gates loomed ahead through the heavy rain, standing like silent sentinels guarding family secrets. I did not know who had sent that mysterious text message or what I was going to find waiting for me inside that dark mansion. But I knew one thing for certain. My family thought they had won. They thought they could abandon me at a cemetery and fly off to a tropical paradise without facing any consequences. They thought I was just the quiet, boring auditor who would swallow their blatant disrespect and fade into the background. They were all terribly, fundamentally wrong. I pulled up to the security keypad and rolled down my window, the cold rain stinging my freezing face. The real story was just beginning, and I was finally ready. I punched the familiar 6-digit code into the glowing keypad, the cold rain pouring down my back, making me shiver violently. My grandfather's birth date and my birth year combined, he had used it for as long as I could remember. The screen blinked red and emitted a harsh buzzing sound, Access denied. I tried again, pressing the metal buttons slower this time, making sure my wet fingers did not slip in the harsh pouring, freezing rain. Red light, buzz access, denied. A cold realization washed over me. Someone had changed the security code? The lawyers would not do that without notifying the family. And my grandfather certainly did not change it before he died. Someone else had been here, and they wanted to make sure nobody else could get inside to discover their filthy secrets. I sat in my idling car, the rain pounding heavily against the fragile windshield. They thought changing a digital code would keep me out of the one place I truly felt safe. They forgot that my grandfather was an incredibly stubborn old-school man who never fully trusted modern technology. He always believed in having a physical backup. I threw the car into park and bravely stepped out into the freezing, relentless downpour. I walked to the massive stone pillar holding the keypad my grandfather had showed me his secret. Years ago, I reached around to the back of the stone pillar, feeling for a loose piece of mortar. Near the base, my fingers carefully brushed against the rough, cold stone until they finally found the slight depression. I pulled the loose rock free and reached deep inside the small, hidden cavity. My freezing fingers closed around heavy, cold brass, the authentic physical master key. I unlocked the pedestrian gate beside the main driveway and slipped through. I did not want to alert whoever was inside by driving my car up the long, sweeping driveway. The walk up to the main house was grueling. The wind whipped my wet hair across my face and my heels sank deep into the muddy grass. The massive stone mansion loomed ahead, completely dark, except for a faint, flickering light coming from the east wing. My grandfather's private study. I approached the heavy oak front door and silently slipped the brass key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I stepped into the grand foyer, closing the heavy door quietly behind me. The house was dead silent, but the air felt heavy, disturbed. My wet shoes squeaked slightly on the polished marble floor, so I slipped them off, leaving them by the entrance. I walked barefoot down the long hallway toward the study. The flickering light I had seen from the outside was casting long, strange shadows into the corridor as I got closer. I began to hear sounds. Not the solemn silence of an empty house mourning its owner, but the frantic rustling of papers, the heavy thud of objects being moved, and the distinct hushed whispers of people arguing. I pressed my back against the cold wall, just outside the open study doors. I held my breath, straining to hear the voices. The first voice I recognized made my heart stop entirely. It was my mother. She sounded frantic, out of breath, and incredibly annoyed. Vivian was complaining about a broken fingernail. Then I heard Chanel, my sister, whining about the dust ruining her designer jacket. Finally, Preston spoke, his voice dripping with his usual arrogant entitlement, telling them both to shut up and keep searching because the lawyers would be arriving by morning. I stepped into the doorway, and what I saw defied all logic and reason. My mother Vivian, my sister Chanel, and my brother-in-law Preston were standing in the middle of my grandfather's pristine study. They were not in Hawaii. They were not sipping cocktails on a tropical beach. The vacation post was a complete lie. It was a fabricated illusion designed to give them the perfect alibi, to skip the funeral, and to make sure nobody would come looking for them here. They had faked a luxury vacation just so they could break into a dead man's house and loot his estate, while the ground was literally still fresh over his casket. The study looked like a disaster area. Books were pulled off the mahogany shelves and thrown onto the floor. Paintings had been ripped from the walls in the corner behind where a large portrait of my grandmother usually hung. The heavy wall safe was completely exposed. Preston was kneeling in front of it, wearing latex gloves, holding a stethoscope to the heavy metal door, and turning the combination dial like a cheap criminal from a movie. My mother was frantically tearing through the drawers of my grandfather's antique desk, stuffing loose jewelry and thick envelopes of cash into her oversized designer handbag. Chanel was holding a flashlight, complaining about the lack of cell service in the room. I could not process the absolute depravity of the scene unfolding before my eyes. These were the people who constantly judged me for my lack of social grace. These were the high society elites who looked down on my honest career, and here they were scavenging like desperate rats in the dark. They had spent their entire lives preaching about class and elegance, demanding that I conform to their rigid expectations of what a successful daughter should look like. They held themselves up as shining pillars of the community, attending their church functions and country club dinners while secretly hiding this kind of ravenous, disgusting greed beneath their polished designer exteriors. Watching them crawl around on my grandfather's expensive Persian rug completely destroyed any lingering respect or love I might have still harbored for them in my heart. They were nothing but cheap frauds, and I was finally seeing their true colors. I stood in the doorway, my wet clothes dripping onto the expensive rug. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. The three of them froze instantly. Preston dropped the stethoscope. My mother slammed the desk drawer shut. Chanel shrieked and dropped the flashlight, which rolled across the floor, casting wild, spinning shadows. They turned to face me, their expressions shifting rapidly from sheer panic to defensive anger. "Brielle?" My mother gasped, clutching her chest. "What are you doing here? You scared me to death." "I could ask you the same question," I replied, stepping fully into the room. "How was the flight from Hawaii? Did you enjoy the beach while they were burying your father in the rain?" Chanel stepped forward, crossing her arms defensively. "We had a change of plans. Okay? The weather in Maui was terrible, so we came back early. We just wanted to check on the house to make sure everything was secure." "You are wearing latex gloves and cracking a safe," I said, pointing at Preston, who was slowly standing up. "You faked a vacation to skip the funeral and rob his estate before the lawyers could inventory his assets." Preston sneered at me, brushing dust off his expensive trousers. "Look at you, playing the righteous auditor. Even now, we are just securing family assets." Brielle Elijah was getting old. He hid things. "We are just making sure the important documents do not get lost in the legal shuffle as his daughter. Your mother has every right to secure what belongs to her." "It does not belong to her yet," I countered, my voice rising with indignation. "The will has not been read. You have no legal right to touch anything in this house. You are looting a dead man's home. You abandoned his funeral to steal from him." My mother's face flushed a deep, angry red. "How dare you speak to us like that? We are securing our legacy. You know nothing about how wealth is managed. If we leave it to the lawyers, they will tie it up in probate for years, taking their cut. We are protecting the family." "Protecting the family," I repeated, the bitter irony burning my throat. "You left me alone at the cemetery. You posted a fake photo to mock his memory. You do not care about family. You only care about money. You are pathetic, all of you." Chanel rolled her eyes, stepping closer to her husband. "Oh, please, Brielle, stop being so dramatic. Grandpa Elijah was basically a stranger to us anyway. He sat in this big, empty house, judging all of us for actually enjoying the money he made. He was an old, miserable man. We are just taking what is owed to us for having to deal with his constant lectures." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He was the only good thing in this entire family. He built everything you're wearing, everything you drive, and everything you boast about. And you could not even give him 2 hours of your time to stand by his grave. My mother marched across the room, her eyes blazing with fury. She raised her hand and struck me hard across the face. The slap echoed like a gunshot in the study. My cheek stung and my head snapped to the side. But I did not step back. I just looked at her, seeing her truly for the first time. The elegant high society matriarch was nothing but a greedy, desperate thief. "You are trespassing!" she hissed at me, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no business being here. You were always a massive disappointment, Brielle, a stubborn, boring girl who refused to elevate this family. This estate is mine. Now I am the eldest daughter. I am the heir. Get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for breaking and entering." Preston chuckled, pulling his wallet from his jacket pocket. He walked over to me, his face twisted into a condescending smirk. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and tossed it at my feet. It fluttered down, landing on the wet floor where I stood. "Go back to your miserable little apartment, Brielle," he said, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. Take the money and buy yourself a hot meal. Let the real heirs handle the complicated business. You are out of your depth here. Go count some beans or whatever it is you do for a living." I looked down at the money, then back up at Preston. I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over me. I was not going to cry. I was not going to scream. I was going to watch them destroy themselves for years. I had let their bitter insults and constant manipulation dictate my entire sense of self-worth, allowing them to gaslight me into believing that my independence was somehow a massive failure, but standing here witnessing their pathetic desperation completely shattered that illusion. I realized that their cruelty was born out of profound weakness, and my ability to stand independently without their tainted money was my greatest strength. I stepped forward completely unfazed by their utterly toxic displays. Before I could say a single word, a deep, commanding voice boomed from the dark hallway behind me. "Stop right there!" We all froze. A tall, distinguished man stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light of the study. He was wearing a dark tailored suit, holding a thick leather briefcase. It was Lawyer Hayes, my grandfather's personal attorney and the executor of his estate. He looked at the torn-apart room, the open desk drawers, the exposed safe, and the $100 bill on the floor. His expression was a mask of cold professional fury. "Nobody is leaving, and nobody is taking a single dime," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Put everything back exactly where you found it. The will is being read right now." Lawyer Hayes walked further into the destroyed study, his presence commanding the room. He ignored the chaos of the pulled-out drawers, the scattered documents, and the exposed wall safe. He walked straight to the large mahogany desk and placed his thick leather briefcase down with a heavy thud. "Sit down, all of you," he ordered, his voice carrying a strict authority that brooked no argument. My mother, Vivian, immediately tried to compose her disheveled appearance. She smoothed down the wrinkles on her expensive designer dress and patted her hair, trying to project the false image of a grieving, dignified daughter, rather than a desperate thief. Caught red-handed in the act, Chanel and Preston hurried over to the plush leather sofa, sitting close together, their greedy eyes glued to the briefcase on the desk. I remained standing near the doorway, my wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to my cold skin. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I thought everyone in the quiet room could hear the frantic rhythm. Lawyer Hayes snapped the brass latches of his briefcase open and pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents bound in a dark blue folder. "This is the last will and testament of Elijah James," he announced, looking at each of us in turn. It was finalized and notarized exactly 3 weeks prior to his sudden passing. The room fell into a suffocating, tense silence. The only sound was the heavy rain continuing to lash against the large glass windows of the dark study. Lawyer Hayes began to read the document, his steady voice filling the tense space. He read through the standard legal jargon, the declarations of a sound mind, and the formal revocation of any previous wills. It felt like an absolute eternity as he methodically laid out the parameters of my grandfather's vast empire. He detailed the massive commercial real estate holdings spread across the entire eastern seaboard, the fleet of hundreds of commercial shipping trucks, the lucrative international logistics hubs, and the various high-yield offshore investment accounts. My mother was practically vibrating with anticipation on her chair, her eyes wide with unadulterated greed. Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, a hungry, predatory look crossing his smug face. Chanel simply looked arrogant, already calculating exactly how many designer handbags and luxury tropical vacations she could buy with the family wealth. Finally, Lawyer Hayes reached the distribution of the primary estate to my eldest and only daughter, Vivian. He read, reading directly from the thick document. "I leave my entire logistics and shipping corporation, currently valued at exactly $40 million, along with this Buckhead estate, all its contents and all associated liquid bank accounts." Vivian let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure triumph. She threw her hands over her mouth, feigning shock, but her eyes were gleaming with victorious malice. She turned and hugged Chanel tightly while Preston let out a low whistle of approval, muttering $40 million under his breath, as if he had just won the ultimate lottery. They acted as if they had not just been caught trying to rob the place blind. Their arrogant entitlement was absolutely sickening to witness. I stood there feeling a deep, hollow numbness settling deep into my bones. I did not care about the money. I never had. I only cared about the remarkable man who was gone forever. But it stung deeply to see his incredible life's work handed over to the shallow people who despised everything he actually stood for. Then, Lawyer Hayes turned his solemn gaze directly toward me. He reached back into his large, dark briefcase and pulled out another item. It was not a stack of money or a thick folder of valuable property deeds. It was a battered old leather briefcase. It was heavily scuffed and severely worn around the edges. The dark brown leather faded from years of heavy daily use. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact same briefcase my grandfather used to carry. Every single day when he first started his business 30 years ago, before he had the fancy corner office and the billion-dollar net worth to my brilliant granddaughter, Brielle Lawyer Hayes. Continued, his voice softening, just a fraction. For the first time I leave my original leather briefcase and this personal written note. He walked across the study and handed the old heavy bag to me, along with a small, sealed white envelope. I took the bag, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it onto the floor. The worn leather felt soft and intensely familiar beneath my fingertips, holding a faint, comforting trace of his signature cedar and tobacco cologne. I ripped open the envelope, my vision blurring with fresh, hot tears. The note inside was written in his familiar, steady, authoritative handwriting. It was not a long letter of explanation or a tearful, emotional goodbye. It was just one single cryptic sentence. It read, "Remember what I taught you about the numbers, Brielle." That was it. There was absolutely nothing else, no money, no property, no shares in the massive company, just an empty old bag and a strange sentence about numbers. I stared at the piece of white paper, desperately trying to comprehend the hidden meaning behind his final words. My grandfather was a meticulous, calculating man who never did anything without a very specific strategic reason. But in that moment, standing in my freezing wet clothes, holding a beat-up briefcase, I felt completely and utterly defeated by the devastating outcome. The tense, uncomfortable silence in the study was suddenly broken by a sharp, obnoxious sound. Chanel burst into a loud, cruel fit of laughter. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at the old beaten-up briefcase in my hands and threw her head back, giggling uncontrollably. An old, empty bag. She gasped out, clutching her stomach as if it was the funniest joke she had ever heard. An old, empty bag and a piece of paper. "Oh my God, Brielle, you got exactly what you deserved. Absolute garbage." Preston joined in his deep, arrogant laughter, echoing off the expensive mahogany walls. He stood up from the leather sofa and walked over to me, looking down his nose with pure, undisguised contempt. "Well, look on the bright side, Brielle," he sneered, a vicious, ugly smirk playing on his lips. "You can use that hideous old bag to carry your cheap, packed lunches to your boring little auditing job. It is perfectly suited for a low-level, pathetic employee like you. You finally have a matching accessory that perfectly captures your miserable lifestyle." Vivian stood up from the desk chair, her newfound power and staggering wealth instantly going straight to her head. She looked at me with an expression of pure, absolute disgust, as if I was a stray, diseased dog that had wandered into her pristine mansion. "You are a complete disgrace to this family name. Brielle," she spat out, her voice dripping with toxic venom. "I am the sole owner of this massive estate. Now I own the $40 million empire, and I own the very floor you are dripping your filthy rainwater on. Right now." She picked up the heavy landline phone on the desk and hastily dialed the front gate security shack, sending a chilling direct order to the guards stationed outside. I need 2 officers at the main house immediately, she demanded harshly into the receiver. We have an unwanted trespasser who needs to be physically removed from my property. She slammed the phone down and marched toward me, stopping just inches from my face. You have no legal right to be here anymore, she hissed, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. You are officially cut off from this family. Do you hear me? You will never contact us again. You will never ask us for a single dime, and you will never ever show your face at any high society events in Atlanta. You are nothing but a massive failure, and I am finally free of your embarrassing presence. The heavy study doors swung open, and 2 burly security guards stepped inside. They looked confused and slightly apologetic, recognizing me instantly as the grandfather's favorite grandkid, but they were strictly bound to follow the firm orders of the new legal owner. Mom, they said, looking at me with deep pity, we have to ask you to leave the premises right now. Preston crossed his arms and laughed again, escorted out by security. What a fitting tragic end for the family outcast. Chanel waved her hand dismissively. Bye, Brielle. Enjoy your dirty trash bag. The guards stepped forward, placing their heavy hands on my shoulders. I did not fight them. I did not scream or cry in front of them, giving them the satisfaction. I simply clutched my grandfather's old leather briefcase tightly to my chest and allowed the guards to guide me out of the study, down the long marble hallway, and toward the heavy oak front doors. My mother's voice echoed violently down the corridor behind me, chasing me out of the only place that had ever felt like a real home. Do not ever come back, she yelled triumphantly. You are dead to me. The guards pushed the heavy front doors open and shoved me out into the freezing, relentless downpour. The massive wooden doors slammed shut behind me with a sickening thud, echoing with absolute finality across the empty porch. I stumbled down the long, sweeping driveway, my bare feet sinking deeply into the freezing mud and wet grass. The harsh rain lashed heavily against my face, mixing seamlessly with the hot, desperate tears that finally began to spill over my cold cheeks. I reached the pedestrian gate and slipped through, hearing the electronic lock engage heavily behind me, sealing me out completely. I climbed into my freezing car, tossing the old leather bag onto the passenger seat, and drove back to my tiny apartment in complete, devastated silence. I was soaked to the absolute bone, shivering violently from the brutal cold and the massive emotional trauma of the night. I walked into my dark, cramped living room and collapsed onto my cheap fabric sofa, pulling the old leather briefcase onto my lap. I hugged it tightly against my chest, burying my wet face into the worn material. The tears came falling hot and fast down my cold cheeks, hitting the top of the bag and sliding down the worn leather sides. I cried for my grandfather. I cried for the family I never really had, and I cried for the sheer, overwhelming injustice of everything that had just occurred. As I wept bitterly, I traced my cold fingers aimlessly along the bottom edges of the briefcase, seeking whatever small, tiny comfort I could find in the only physical thing I had left, of the man who raised me. Suddenly, my fingers caught on something strange. The bottom of the bag felt unnaturally heavy and incredibly uneven. I pressed my hands firmly against the inner fabric of the bag, exploring the rigid bottom lining. There was a thick, hard lump hidden deep beneath the inner lining of the briefcase, completely concealed from the outside. My heart skipped a beat in my chest. I jumped up from the sofa and ran into my small kitchen, grabbing a sharp pair of scissors from the utility drawer. I rushed back to the living room and carefully wedged the sharp metal tip into the worn seam of the inner lining. I sliced open the dark fabric, tearing the heavy material apart to expose the hidden compartment. Wedged tightly between the thick leather exterior and the fabric lining was a heavy metallic rectangular object. I pulled it out and stared at it in complete and utter shock. Sitting quietly in the palm of my shaking hand was a highly encrypted military-grade USB drive. My heart started pounding wildly against my ribs. racing with sudden massive adrenaline as I realized my grandfather did not leave me an empty bag. He left me a secret. The cryptic note echoed loudly in my mind. Remember what I taught you about the numbers, Brielle. He knew exactly what they were going to do, and he had left me the ultimate weapon. The morning sun broke through the thin blinds of my small apartment, casting long gray shadows across the cheap laminate floor. I had not slept a single second. My eyes were bloodshot and stinging from crying all night, but my mind was laser-focused on the heavy encrypted USB drive sitting quietly on my kitchen counter. I knew I needed a clear head and professional tools to crack military-grade encryption. I decided to head into the office early to use my secure dual-monitor setup and the advanced decryption software we utilized for corporate forensic audits. I dressed in my sharpest navy blue suit, pulling my hair back into a tight, severe bun, trying to mask the absolute devastation that was currently tearing my soul apart. I grabbed my work bag, slipping the metal USB drive deep into the inner pocket, where it felt incredibly heavy like a loaded weapon pressing against my side. I drove through the busy Atlanta morning traffic, my mind racing with endless theories about what my grandfather had hidden from the rest of the world. When I finally pulled into the towering glass parking garage of my prestigious auditing firm, I took a deep breath, ready to bury myself in the familiar comforting rhythm of numbers and spreadsheets. But the moment I stepped out of the sleek elevator and onto the executive floor, the atmosphere felt completely wrong. My colleagues, people I had worked side by side with for 5 grueling years, suddenly stopped talking and looked away as I walked past. The usual morning greetings were entirely absent, replaced by harsh, tense silence and uncomfortable darting glances. I kept my head held high, forcing myself to walk steadily toward my cubicle. But before I could even set my bag down on my desk, my manager, Mr. Davis, stepped out of his corner office. His face was a mask of cold fury, and his arms were crossed tightly across his chest. "Brielle, my office right now," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the silent bullpen. I walked into his office to find the head of human resources already sitting at the small conference table, clutching a thick manila folder. My stomach completely dropped. I had a stellar record. I was the top-performing auditor in the entire division, consistently bringing in the most difficult accounts. "Please sit down," Mr. Davis said, not offering even a hint of his usual morning warmth. "We have received some extremely disturbing information from one of our highest-tier financial partners. A prominent investment broker reached out directly to the regional board of directors early this morning." Preston, I thought, my blood running completely cold. Preston had used his elite white finance connections to strike the first blow. Mr. Davis opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper toward me. "This broker claims that you have been secretly accessing and leaking highly confidential client data to unauthorized third parties," he stated flatly. "The allegations are incredibly detailed and backed by several other prominent members of the Atlanta financial elite. They claim you have been compromising sensitive portfolios for personal financial gain." I stared at the paper in absolute shock. It was a complete fabrication, a calculated, disgusting lie designed to destroy my career and strip away my only source of independent income. "This is a lie," I said, my voice shaking with raw anger. "My brother-in-law Preston is a malicious opportunist who is trying to ruin my life because of a private family dispute regarding my grandfather's estate. I have never leaked a single document in my entire life. My audit logs are completely flawless." The HR representative shook her head, her expression devoid of any professional sympathy. "Your audit logs have already been restricted, Brielle. Whether the allegations are true or not, the sheer magnitude of the individuals making these claims makes you a massive liability to this firm. We deal with elite clients who demand absolute discretion, and your reputation in the financial sector has been completely compromised as of this morning. As of right now, your employment here is terminated effectively immediately. You are not to access your computer, you are not to speak to any clients, and you are to leave the building right now." I could not believe what I was hearing. Preston had essentially blacklisted me from the entire financial industry in a single morning, using his network of wealthy, influential friends to crush my hard-earned career. He knew I needed my auditing job to survive without their family money, so he completely destroyed it. I was forced to hand over my security badge and keycard. I was escorted out of the towering glass building by two security guards walking past the staring eyes of my former coworkers. For the second time in 24 hours, I was thrown out onto the street like a common criminal, having my dignity stripped away by people who had absolutely no right to judge me. I sat in my car in the parking garage, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I was furious, shivering, with a rage so profound it made my vision blur. Preston and my mother had declared open warfare on my entire existence. I reached for my phone, desperate to call my best friend and seek some kind of comfort. But my notification screen was flooded with messages from women in our elite church circle, the wealthy, influential socialites my mother spent her entire life trying to impress. I opened the first message from Sister Carmen, the head of the church charity committee. It was a long paragraph filled with fake Christian sympathy, masking deep, malicious judgment. She wrote that she was praying for my wicked soul, and that she could not believe I would abandon my grandfather on his deathbed just to run off with some unknown man. The message claimed that my poor mother was utterly devastated by my callous, selfish behavior, and that I was no longer welcome to volunteer at the upcoming charity gala. I read message after message, the sick, twisted narrative becoming clearer with every notification. My mother, Vivian, had gone on a vicious, calculated smear campaign. The moment the sun came up, she had called every influential woman in our elite African-American high society circle, crying fake crocodile tears and spinning a disgusting web of lies. She told them that I was a rebellious, ungrateful daughter who refused to attend the funeral because I was too busy chasing after men. She claimed I was a massive disappointment to the family legacy, a greedy child who had shown up at the estate after the funeral, demanding money and threatening violence against my grieving mother and sister. She painted herself as the tragic, heartbroken matriarch, trying to hold her elegant family together while dealing with a deeply disturbed, dangerous daughter. My mother knew exactly how the upper echelons of Atlanta society worked. She knew that reputation was everything, and gossip was the ultimate weapon. She used her country club connections and her position in the church to completely assassinate my character before I could even process my grandfather's death. She had effectively turned my entire community against me, cutting off any possible avenue of social support or sympathy. Friends I had known since childhood blocked my phone number. People I had volunteered with for years deleted me from their social media circles. My inbox was filled with nasty messages from extended relatives who had blindly believed Vivian's toxic narrative without even bothering to ask for my side of the story. They called me a gold digger, a disgrace to my grandfather's memory, and a stain on our prestigious family name. I was utterly isolated, entirely ostracized by the very people who were supposed to uplift and support our community during times of grief. My mother had made sure that nobody in the city would hire me, nobody would help me, and nobody would even listen to my side of the story. She wanted me broken, homeless, and begging for her mercy on my hands and knees. She drastically underestimated my absolute refusal to surrender. I sat in my car reading through the endless stream of venomous texts, my heart breaking a little more with every single word. Women I had grown up respecting, women who had smiled at my grandfather's funeral and patted my mother's back, were now calling me a Jezebel and a traitor to my own blood. It was astonishing how quickly the high society socialites of Atlanta could turn on one of their own without a single shred of actual evidence. Vivian knew exactly which buttons to push, invoking the sanctity of family and the importance of respecting elders to make my supposed crimes seem utterly unforgivable. She weaponized our tight-knit community against me, wielding gossip like a finely sharpened blade designed to cut me off from any potential lifeline. I could not even reach out to my local pastor because he had already sent an email stating I needed to seek serious spiritual counseling before returning to the congregation. My mother had thoroughly poisoned the well, salting the earth so that absolutely nothing could grow back for me in this city. She thought this complete social annihilation would force me to crawl back to her begging for forgiveness and a chance to return to the family fold. I drove back to my small apartment feeling the crushing weight of their coordinated attacks bearing down on my shoulders. I had lost my beloved grandfather, my family, my career, my reputation, and my entire social support network in less than 48 hours. They had pushed me to the absolute brink of destruction, stripping away every single thing I had ever worked for. They wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing, but they forgot about the one thing they could never, ever take away from me, my brilliant analytical mind. I locked the door to my apartment, throwing the deadbolt in the chain. I did not bother taking off my suit. I walked straight to my small kitchen table and pulled the encrypted military-grade USB drive out of my pocket. It felt warm against my palm, pulsing with hidden secrets. I booted up my personal laptop, ignoring the barrage of hateful text messages still flooding my phone screen. I plugged the heavy metal drive into the port. The computer chimed a small window popping up on the screen, demanding a 32-character alphanumeric decryption key. I cracked my knuckles, rolling my neck to release the tension. I was a top-tier financial auditor, trained to find vulnerabilities in the most secure corporate networks in the country. Preston and Vivian thought I was just a boring girl who counted beans, but they had no idea how dangerous I could truly be behind a keyboard. I opened my forensic auditing software, running a series of complex brute force algorithms to bypass the initial security protocols. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing lines of code, parsing through the dense digital barriers my grandfather had put in place to protect his ultimate truth. The screen flashed rapidly, lines of data scrolling past at lightning speed. I pushed harder, routing the decryption process through a secondary proxy network I had built years ago. The computer fan whirred loudly, fighting against the heavy processing load. Finally, after 30 grueling minutes of relentless digital combat, the screen froze. A small green box appeared in the center of the monitor. Access granted. The secure vault sprang open, flooding my screen with hundreds of hidden documents, intricate spreadsheets, and highly classified offshore bank statements. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the massive columns of numbers and hidden transaction records. The truth was finally staring me right in the face, exposing a massive, deeply buried financial conspiracy that was going to destroy their perfect, pristine lives. The offshore accounts were all registered under dummy corporations tracing back to the very people who had just tried to ruin my existence. My grandfather's note telling me to remember what he taught me about the numbers suddenly made perfect sense. The numbers never lied, even when family did. I was going to use these documents to tear their fraudulent empire completely to the ground. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes darting across the endless rows of financial data. My grandfather had kept meticulous records of every single transaction that moved through his logistics empire over the past 5 years. As an auditor, I was trained to spot anomalies, and it did not take long for the glaring red flags to reveal themselves. I opened the master ledger for the primary shipping division and immediately noticed a pattern of irregular outgoing wire transfers. These were not standard vendor payments or operational costs. They were massive monthly disbursements categorized as overseas consulting fees and supply chain optimization retainers. The amounts were staggering, sometimes $50,000 a week, sometimes upwards of $200,000 a month. I traced the routing numbers through the offshore banking databases my grandfather had compiled. The money was flowing out of the legitimate corporate accounts and vanishing into a web of shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the registration documents for these offshore entities. I fully expected to see Preston's name buried somewhere in the corporate structuring, but what I found made my breath catch in my throat. The primary shell company receiving the bulk of the embezzled funds was registered entirely under my mother's name, Vivian. A secondary holding company used to launder the stolen cash through fake real estate investments was legally bound to my sister Chanel. Preston had not used his own name anywhere. He was a high-level finance broker who knew exactly how to hide his dirty tracks. For the past 3 years, he had been quietly siphoning millions of dollars out of my grandfather's logistics company and funneling it straight into accounts controlled by his wife and mother-in-law. But looking at the digital signatures and IP access logs, it was incredibly obvious that Vivian and Chanel had absolutely no idea these companies even existed. Preston had likely slipped the incorporation papers into stacks of routine tax documents or mortgage applications and told them to just sign on the dotted line. They were so blinded by his prestigious Wall Street pedigree and so desperately eager to maintain their wealthy socialite facade that they probably never even bothered to read a single word they were signing. He had set them up as the perfect oblivious patsies. I continued digging deeper into the encrypted folders, my anger growing with every single file I opened. The wire fraud was systemic and incredibly aggressive. Preston was not just skimming off the top, he was bleeding the entire logistics empire completely dry. He had manipulated the corporate credit lines, taking out massive unapproved loans against the company's physical assets and transferring that capital straight into the hidden offshore accounts. My grandfather must have discovered the embezzlement a few months before he died. There were internal audit requests and drafted legal injunctions saved in a restricted folder, but his sudden failing health had obviously prevented him from stopping Preston in time. Instead of confronting them while he was weak and dying, my grandfather had gathered all the digital evidence and locked it away securely, waiting for the right person to find it. He knew I was the only one in the family with the financial literacy and the relentless determination required to expose the truth. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Preston had embezzled nearly $18 million over 36 months, using his position as the trusted family financial advisor to completely bypass standard corporate oversight. He attended their lavish dinner parties, smiling and drinking their expensive wine while secretly robbing the family blind. And my mother had handed him the keys to the kingdom, willingly pushing me away and elevating him simply because he had the right skin color and the right job title to impress her shallow country club friends. I opened another encrypted spreadsheet labeled IRS, flagged accounts, and the true genius of my grandfather's final move suddenly became devastatingly clear. This was the white-collar twist that would utterly destroy them. The $40 million logistics empire that my mother had just inherited with such triumphant, malicious glee was not an empire at all. It was a massive ticking time bomb. Preston had drained all the actual liquidity and saddled the core holding company with astronomical corporate debt. The documents on my screen showed missed tax payments, unpaid commercial loans, and severely leveraged property deeds. The company was essentially a hollowed-out shell hovering on the absolute brink of total insolvency. But the most terrifying document in the folder was a confidential notice from the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government had already flagged the company for massive tax evasion and severe financial irregularities. There was an active, ongoing secret federal investigation into the missing funds. My mother was currently popping champagne corks and celebrating her massive inheritance, completely unaware that she had just legally accepted ownership of a financially ruined corporation, carrying tens of millions of dollars in federal tax debt and hidden corporate liabilities. By eagerly signing the inheritance papers, without demanding a single independent financial audit, my mother had officially made herself legally responsible for the entire mess. She was the sole owner and CEO on record. When the IRS finally moved in to seize the assets and freeze the accounts, they would look directly at Vivian. And when they traced the missing millions of dollars, they would find the offshore shell companies registered entirely in the names of Vivian and Chanel. Preston had orchestrated the perfect, flawless escape plan. He had stolen the wealth, hidden it offshore under their identities, and was now perfectly positioned to watch them take the monumental federal fall for his massive financial crimes. He would probably act shocked and devastated when the federal agents arrived to arrest his wife and his mother-in-law. He would play the role of the tragic, supportive husband while secretly planning to flee the country and live like a king on the stolen millions in the Bahamas. The sheer evil calculation of his plan was almost impressive in its absolute sociopathic cruelty. He had weaponized their greed and their arrogant stupidity against them. They were so obsessed with status and quick wealth that they walked completely blind right into a devastating federal trap. I pushed my chair back from the kitchen table, my mind spinning rapidly with the monumental weight of these incredible revelations. I finally had the power to completely destroy all of them. I could sit back and simply watch the federal government tear their glamorous fake lives to shreds. I could watch my mother lose her beloved country club memberships and face decades in federal prison for tax evasion and wire fraud. I could watch my sister realize that her perfect, wealthy husband was actually a manipulative criminal who had framed her to take the fall for his massive embezzlement scheme. The thought brought a brief, dark surge of vindictive satisfaction to my exhausted mind. They had thrown me out into the freezing rain and ruined my professional reputation in a single morning. They deserved absolutely every single terrible thing that was coming to them. But the more I stared at the glowing screen, the more I realized that simply letting the inevitable disaster unfold was not going to be enough. Preston was far too slippery and far too well connected in the elite white financial circles of Atlanta. If the federal agents raided the company tomorrow, Preston would immediately hire the best defense attorneys in the state. He would distance himself entirely, claiming he was just offering casual advice, and that Vivian and Chanel were the sole masterminds behind the offshore accounts. He would use his privileged status and his polished Wall Street charisma to charm the investigators while throwing my family completely under the bus. He would worm his way out of the consequences and escape with the stolen millions, leaving my mother and sister to rot in a federal penitentiary. As much as I deeply despised Vivian and Chanel for their horrific cruelty, I could not let Preston walk away completely unpunished. He was the true architect of this misery, and he needed to be the one wearing federal handcuffs to ensure that Preston could not escape the blast radius of this collapsing empire. I needed ironclad, indisputable proof of his direct involvement in the wire fraud scheme. The documents my grandfather left me were incredibly damning, but they were largely circumstantial regarding Preston's actual physical execution of the transfers. I needed to connect his personal digital fingerprints directly to the offshore routing networks. I needed audio recordings, internal emails, or hidden communication logs proving that Preston was the sole operator moving the money and intentionally framing his wife and mother-in-law. I needed a flawless chain of evidence that not even the most expensive defense attorney in the country could ever dismantle. I stood up and paced the short length of my small apartment, my bare feet pacing softly against the cheap floorboards. My mind shifted into the cold, calculating gear of a senior financial auditor, planning a massive corporate takedown. I could not just hand this USB drive over to the authorities right now. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. I needed to lull Preston into a false sense of total security. He believed he had completely eliminated me as a threat by getting me fired and socially ostracized. He thought I was currently sitting in my apartment, broken, defeated, and entirely powerless. I needed to use his monumental, arrogant underestimation of me to my absolute advantage. I walked back to the laptop and began making secure, encrypted backups of every single file on the drive. I uploaded the entire cache of financial documents to a decentralized cloud server hidden behind multiple proxy walls, ensuring the data could never be erased or compromised. I meticulously organized the spreadsheets, cross-referencing every fraudulent wire transfer with the corresponding date and timestamps. I was building an impenetrable cage of digital evidence designed specifically to trap a corporate predator. Preston thought he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He thought his Wall Street background made him completely invincible to consequence. But he had severely miscalculated my grandfather's intelligence and my relentless professional dedication to uncovering the absolute truth. As the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, filling my apartment with bright light, I felt a new, profound sense of purpose settling into my tired bones. The agonizing pain of losing my grandfather and the devastating betrayal of my family were still fresh wounds, but they were no longer paralyzing me. They were fueling a quiet, dangerous determination. Vivian wanted to parade around Atlanta pretending she was a brilliant, powerful business magnate. Chanel wanted to flaunt her stolen wealth and her perfect elite marriage. Preston wanted to steal millions and leave them holding the bag. I was going to let them enjoy their fragile glass castle for a little longer. I was going to let them get so incredibly comfortable in their stolen luxury that they would never see the devastating blow coming. I gently pulled the metal USB drive from the port, closing the laptop screen with a soft, definitive click. The dangerous game had fundamentally changed overnight. I was no longer the sad, discarded daughter crying in the pouring rain at a lonely cemetery. I was the sole executioner of my grandfather's final will and the ultimate architect of their impending destruction. I walked into my bathroom and washed the dried tear stains from my tired face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I took a deep breath, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. Preston and Vivian had started a ruthless war without understanding who they were fighting. They thought they had buried me alive, but they handed me the shovel to dig their graves. 1 month had passed since the reading of the will and the brutal theft of my career. My mother wasted absolutely no time parading her newly inherited wealth in front of the entire Atlanta elite. To cement her status as the new chief executive officer of my grandfather's logistics empire, Vivian organized the most ostentatious high society gala the city had seen in a decade. It was held at a prestigious downtown ballroom, a venue that commanded astronomical prices just to walk through the front doors. Social media was completely flooded with updates about the event. Chanel posted endless videos of the imported floral arrangements, the crystal chandeliers, and the $100,000 catering spread. They were burning through cash with reckless, arrogant abandon, completely unaware that every single dollar they spent was pushing them deeper into a massive federal tax crater. I knew I had to be there. I needed to look Preston right in the eyes and let him know that his invisible digital walls had been completely breached. I needed to rattle him to make him paranoid so he would make a sloppy mistake before the federal agents closed in. Getting into the highly secure gala was not going to be easy, especially since Vivian had undoubtedly put my face on every security blacklist in the building. But my grandfather had not just left me his business acumen, he had also introduced me to his trusted network of old-school fixers. I reached out to an old colleague of his, a quiet, discreet man named Mr. Carter, who operated heavily in the shadows of the Atlanta financial district. When I told him what Preston was doing to the company my grandfather built, Mr. Carter was completely disgusted. He secured me a flawless fake credential under the alias of a wealthy foreign investor, looking to expand into commercial shipping. I spent hours getting ready for the infiltration. I wore a sleek, sophisticated emerald green evening gown that hugged my frame, perfectly paired with elegant, understated jewelry that screamed old money rather than flashy, newly acquired wealth. I pulled my hair into a sleek, sophisticated style and applied a bold, dark lipstick that made me look completely unrecognizable from the tired, exhausted auditor they had thrown out into the rain a month ago. When I pulled up to the valet stand in a rented luxury sedan, the valets rushed to open my door, treating me with the utmost respect. I walked up the grand marble staircase, handing my forged golden invitation to the stern security guards at the entrance. They scanned the barcode, and the machine blinked a solid, welcoming green. The heavy doors swung open, and I stepped into a world of absolute sickening excess. The ballroom was a blinding sea of diamonds, silk, and forced polite laughter. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided gracefully across the floor, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate caviar hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with the most influential people in Atlanta: local politicians, wealthy pastors from the elite church circles, and ruthless business tycoons. And standing right in the center of the massive room, basking in the glowing spotlight, like royalty, was my family. Vivian was wearing a custom designer gown dripping in heavy diamond jewelry that I knew belonged to my late grandmother. She was holding court, laughing loudly and accepting endless praise from the shallow women who had ostracized me just weeks before. Chanel stood next to her wearing a ridiculous amount of sparkling couture, hanging onto Preston's arm like he was the ultimate prize. Preston looked incredibly smug wearing a tailored imported tuxedo, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon while telling some boring corporate anecdote to a group of captive listeners. They looked so perfectly polished, so utterly invincible, living out their ultimate high society fantasy on the back of my grandfather's hard work and massive federal debt. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and casually blended into the crowd, moving slowly and methodically toward their roped-off VIP table. I stayed in the shadows of the large floral centerpieces, observing their sickeningly fake interactions. Preston was charming the room, flashing his bright white teeth, making empty promises about massive future corporate expansions. He was selling them the exact same fraudulent dream he had sold my mother and sister. I watched him closely, noting the slight nervous tick in his jaw whenever someone asked too specific a question about the company's quarterly earnings. He was feeling the pressure holding up a collapsing house of cards while smiling through his teeth. The moment to strike finally presented itself when the string quartet began playing a loud classical piece, drawing the attention of the crowd toward the stage. Vivian and Chanel were momentarily distracted by a passing photographer posing for yet another shallow social media post. Preston remained seated at the VIP table, casually checking his phone with a bored expression. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the small folded piece of paper inside my clutch purse. It was time to let the wolf know that he was actually the prey. I glided across the polished floor, slipping past the velvet ropes with such absolute confidence that the nearby security guards did not even blink. I approached the VIP table, from behind, Preston leaning down slightly, so my face was right next to his ear. He did not notice me until the very last second, assuming I was just another wealthy socialite coming to praise his supposed financial genius. "Hello, Preston," I whispered, my voice dangerously low and smooth. He flinched visibly, spilling a few drops of his expensive bourbon onto the pristine white tablecloth. He whipped his head around, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he registered my face. "Brielle," he hissed, looking frantically around the room to see if anyone else had noticed my arrival. "How the hell did you get in here? Security is supposed to keep out the trash." I ignored his pathetic insult and calmly pulled the folded piece of paper from my clutch. I placed it directly onto the table right in front of his bourbon glass and slid it slowly toward his hand. "I highly suggest you look at that before you call your guards," I said quietly, maintaining a perfectly polite smile for any onlookers who might be glancing our way. Preston sneered at me, trying to maintain his arrogant composure, but his curiosity clearly got the better of him. He unfolded the paper, keeping it shielded from the view of the surrounding tables. It was a single, heavily redacted page from the offshore bank statements I had decrypted. I had carefully blacked out the account numbers and the specific routing details, but I left the dates, the massive transfer amounts, and the names of the shell companies registered to Vivian and Chanel perfectly visible. I watched the blood completely drain from Preston's face in real time. His arrogant, smug expression shattered, instantly replaced by a look of stark, primal terror. His breathing hitched and his hand began to tremble slightly, causing the paper to shake in his grip. He looked up at me, his eyes darting wildly, trying to calculate how much I actually knew and how deeply his impenetrable digital fortress had been compromised. "Your brilliant white-collar genius is nothing but a cheap, pathetic Ponzi scheme," I whispered, leaning closer, so only he could hear the venom in my voice. "I know about the wire fraud, Preston. I know about the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I know you have been bleeding my grandfather's empire entirely dry for 3 years, while making your wife and my mother sign the dummy incorporation papers. And most importantly, I know about the $40 million tax hole you left behind for Vivian to fall into." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He tried to speak, to formulate some kind of smooth, manipulative lie to talk his way out of the corner, but the sheer weight of the evidence sitting on the table in front of him completely paralyzed his silver tongue. "You are insane," he finally managed to whisper, his voice cracking slightly. "You forged this. Nobody is going to believe a bitter-fired auditor with a vendetta. They will believe the decentralized federal blockchain. When I submit the unredacted files, I countered smoothly, my smile never wavering. You thought you were so incredibly smart, manipulating two greedy, clueless women into holding the bag for your massive federal crimes. You thought getting me fired would keep me quiet, but all it did was give me endless free time to completely dismantle your entire fake life. You are a criminal, Preston, and your ticking clock just ran out of time. Before Preston could even attempt to respond, a loud, piercing screech shattered the tense silence between us. "What is she doing here?" Vivian screamed, her shrill voice slicing through the elegant classical music playing in the ballroom. I stood up straight, turning to face my mother and sister. Vivian was storming toward the VIP table, her face contorted with absolute fury. Chanel was right behind her, looking both disgusted and horrified that her glamorous gala was being interrupted by the family outcast. The surrounding guests immediately stopped talking, turning their heads to watch the drama unfold. The entire ballroom fell into a hushed, breathless silence. "I told security to ban you from this venue," Vivian shrieked, pointing a shaking, diamond-covered finger at my face. "How dare you sneak into my celebration, you ungrateful, jealous little rat. You are trying to ruin the most important night of my life because you cannot handle the fact that I am a successful CEO and you are nothing but an unemployed loser." Preston immediately seized the opportunity to play the victim and deflect the attention away from the damning piece of paper still sitting on the table. He quickly crumpled the redacted bank statement in his fist, shoving it deep into his tuxedo pocket. He stood up, putting on a masterclass performance of the calm, protective husband. He placed a soothing hand on Vivian's shoulder, looking at me with an expression of deep, manufactured pity. "Vivian, please calm down," Preston said, his voice loud enough for the nearby wealthy guests to hear clearly. "Brielle is clearly unwell. She sneaked in here to beg for money because she was fired from her auditing firm for leaking confidential data. She is desperate and acting out. We should just have security escort her out gently before she embarrasses herself any further." Chanel scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Oh my God. Brielle, you are so utterly pathetic. Sneaking into a VIP gala just to beg my husband for a handout. You look completely ridiculous. Go back to your cheap apartment and leave high society to the people who actually belong here." Vivian was practically vibrating with rage, her chest heaving as she glared at me. She could not stand the fact that I was standing there looking completely composed and elegant, refusing to cower under her furious gaze. Her desperate need to assert dominance over me in front of her elite friends completely overrode any sense of high society decorum. She grabbed a full glass of expensive red wine from the table and hurled the contents violently right into my face. The dark crimson liquid splashed heavily across my cheek, staining the front of my beautiful emerald green gown and dripping coldly down my neck. Loud gasps erupted from the crowd of onlookers. Several women covered their mouths in shock, while others whispered frantically to their companions. Chanel let out a sharp, cruel laugh, pulling out her phone to probably text her friends about the dramatic scene. Preston sighed, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Someone call security," he ordered a passing waiter. "This poor woman clearly needs a psychological evaluation. She is completely unhinged." I stood perfectly still, letting the cold wine drip from my chin. I did not raise my voice. I did not wipe the wine from my face. I did not give them the satisfaction of a defensive emotional reaction. I just looked at the three of them, seeing the pathetic, fragile illusion they were clinging to so desperately. They thought this public humiliation was a massive victory for their social status. They thought throwing a drink in my face somehow proved their immense superiority. They had absolutely no idea that they were dancing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. I slowly reached into my clutch and pulled out a delicate white silk handkerchief, calmly dabbing the wine from my cheek. I looked right into my mother's furious eyes and smiled a genuine, chilling smile that made her falter for a split second. "Enjoy the empire, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent, tense ballroom. "I truly hope you like what Grandpa left you. It fits you perfectly." I turned my back on them and walked away, my head held high, my posture radiating absolute unbreakable confidence. The crowd parted for me immediately, stepping aside as if I were royalty. The security guards rushed into the ballroom, but they did not touch me. They simply followed me at a respectful distance, completely intimidated by the sheer commanding presence I projected as I glided across the polished floor. I did not look back as I exited through the grand double doors, leaving Vivian Preston and Chanel to wallow in the toxic, fake glory of their doomed celebration. The wine staining my dress felt like a badge of honor, a physical reminder of their desperate, fragile weakness. I had planted the seed of absolute paranoia deep inside Preston's mind. He would not sleep tonight. He would frantically check his hidden offshore accounts, terrified of what I was going to do next. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the massive federal hammer was preparing to drop directly onto their arrogant heads. I stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air, breathing deeply, completely ready for the final devastating war to begin. Preston did not sleep that night. I knew he would not, because men who build their entire existence on stolen money live in constant fear of the wind changing direction. The single redacted bank statement I left on his VIP table was a digital guillotine swinging directly over his head. He knew I had breached his offshore accounts. He knew I saw the Cayman Island transfers, and he knew his $40 million tax fraud was entirely exposed. But instead of running, Preston did exactly what a cornered narcissist always does. He doubled down and decided to attack his fragile ego, could not handle the fact that a black female auditor had completely outsmarted his pristine white-collar Wall Street facade. The next morning, the frantic wheels of his manipulation began to turn. He convinced my mother that I was a psychotic, jealous daughter trying to extort the family. He spun a pathetic lie, claiming the document I showed him was a forged fake designed to blackmail them. He told Vivian that if they did not utterly crush me, I would spend the rest of my life harassing them for a piece of the inheritance. He played on her deep-seated insecurities and her desperate need to protect her newly acquired high society status. He told her, "The only way to silence me permanently was to strip away my last remaining asset, to leave me completely destitute and unable to afford any legal representation. He wanted to bleed me dry so I could never afford to hire a forensic accountant to look into the corporate books." 4 days after the gala, a loud, aggressive knock echoed through my small condo. I opened the door to find a process server standing in the hallway. He handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away. Without a single word, I opened the heavy packet and read the legal filing sitting inside. My mother was officially suing me in civil court. She was demanding the immediate revocation of the deed to my condo, a modest 2-bedroom apartment that my grandfather Elijah had purchased for me outright over 10 years ago. When I first graduated with my accounting degree, the condo was the only place I had left in the world, the only safe harbor I owned free and clear. The legal grounds for the lawsuit were absolutely sickening. Vivian's expensive, high-powered attorneys drafted a ruthless petition claiming that my grandfather had been suffering from early-onset dementia and diminished mental capacity at the exact time he gifted me the property. They argued that I had manipulated a confused, vulnerable old man into buying me real estate, and that the asset rightfully belonged back in the primary estate portfolio, which was now entirely controlled by my mother. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. My grandfather was sharper at 80 than most men are at 30. He ran a massive logistics empire until his dying breath, parsing complex shipping contracts with absolute clarity. But truth did not matter. In civil court, only leverage mattered, and they believed they had all the leverage in the world. Preston and Vivian wanted me homeless. They knew I had been unjustly fired from my auditing firm, and that I was currently living off my savings. They calculated that facing a massive civil lawsuit against a team of ruthless corporate lawyers would completely bankrupt me. They wanted to force me to spend every last dime I had on defensive legal fees, so I would be too poor and too exhausted to ever blow the whistle on Preston's wire fraud. They were trying to starve me out to crush me under the heavy boot of their stolen wealth. They wanted to see me broken, begging on the street, and entirely dependent on their mercy, a mercy that I knew did not exist. I sat on my living room sofa, reading the vicious lawsuit over and over again. Any normal person would have been terrified. The threat of losing your home and facing a relentless legal barrage is enough to break a person's spirit. But as I stared at the crisp white legal paper, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Preston thought he was playing four-dimensional chess, but he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute my grandfather's final plan. If I took the encrypted USB drive straight to the FBI right now, Preston would just hire an army of defense attorneys. He would drag the investigation out for years. He would claim he was just a casual consultant and blame the entire fraud on my mother and sister. The paper trail was damning, but federal investigations move at a glacial pace. I needed them all in one place. I needed them under oath in front of a judge where perjury and federal tax laws collide instantly, and by filing this greedy, malicious lawsuit, Vivian and Preston had just provided the perfect public stage for their own executions. But for the trap to work flawlessly, I had to play the role they desperately wanted to see. I had to become the pathetic, broken victim they always believed I was. If I showed up with a fierce legal team, they would get spooked and try to settle out of court, keeping the documents sealed. I needed this to go to a public hearing. I needed the documents entered into the public record, where they could never be hidden or erased. I did not hire a lawyer. Instead, I filed a formal response with the court, stating that I would be representing myself pro se. It is a legal term that means standing on your own behalf without legal counsel. In the corporate legal world, showing up pro se against a team of expensive litigators is essentially financial suicide. It signals to the opposing side that you are completely broke, entirely desperate, and utterly defenseless. When Preston saw my filing, he must have thought he had already won. He probably popped a bottle of expensive champagne, celebrating the fact that the annoying little auditor was finally throwing in the towel. The preliminary status hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. I intentionally prepared my wardrobe to sell the illusion of absolute defeat. I did not wear my sharp-tailored auditing suits. I wore an old, faded gray cardigan, a plain, wrinkled blouse, and scuffed flat shoes. I pulled my hair back loosely, letting a few tired strands fall across my face. I did not wear a single drop of makeup, allowing the dark circles under my eyes to show clearly. I needed to look like a woman who was losing sleep, losing money, and losing her grip on reality. The more pathetic I looked, the more arrogant and careless they would become in the courtroom. When I walked into the downtown Atlanta courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with their arrogant anticipation. Vivian was waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom, wearing a bright crimson designer suit dripping in gold jewelry, looking like a high society queen. Completely untouched by grief, Chanel stood next to her, holding a luxury handbag that probably cost more than my entire car. Preston leaned against the marble wall, wearing a smug, victorious grin, checking his expensive watch. Like this entire legal proceeding was just a minor inconvenience in his very important wealthy day. When they saw me walking down the corridor clutching a cheap plastic folder instead of a leather briefcase, their eyes lit up with malicious, predatory joy. Chanel actually let out a sharp, cruel laugh, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. "Oh my God," she whispered loudly to our mother. "Look at her. She looks like she crawled out of a dumpster." Vivian smiled, a cold, tight line of pure satisfaction. "This is what happens when you disrespect your family. Brielle, you end up with absolutely nothing." Preston pushed off the wall and stepped into my path, blocking my way to the courtroom doors, his tall frame looming over me. He looked down at my cheap plastic folder and let out a condescending sigh. "It did not have to be this way, Brielle," he said, his voice dripping with fake pity. "If you had just stayed in your lane and accepted your place, we would not have to take your little apartment away, but you wanted to play dangerous games, and now you get to face the consequences. You should just sign the settlement papers and surrender the deed today. It will save you the embarrassment of a public eviction." I looked down at my scuffed shoes, forcing my shoulders to slump. I made my hands tremble slightly, gripping my cheap folder tighter, as if I was terrified. I am not giving up my home, I stammered, making my voice sound weak and utterly defeated. Grandpa wanted me to have it. It is not fair. Fair. Vivian laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed down the marble hallway. Life is not fair, Brielle. You stole from a confused old man, and now we are taking it back. You represent yourself in there because you are completely broke. Nobody wants to help a fired, disgraced auditor. You played your hand and you lost miserably. Now get out of my way before I call security. I stepped aside, keeping my head down, playing the role of the submissive, beaten dog perfectly. They marched past me through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, their expensive shoes clicking loudly on the polished floor. Their lawyers trailed behind them, carrying massive boxes of fabricated evidence and aggressive legal motions. They thought they were walking into a slaughterhouse where I was the main course. They had absolutely no idea that while I was pretending to be broken, I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously preparing the most devastating financial counterattack in Atlanta court history. Behind the cheap plastic covers of my folder, I had perfectly organized the decrypted contents of my grandfather's USB drive. I had printed the offshore wire transfer logs, the hidden shell company registrations, carrying Vivian's and Chanel's names and the exact federal tax codes Preston had violated. I had cross-referenced every single stolen dollar, mapping the exact flow of the $40 million embezzlement scheme connecting Preston's personal digital signature to every fraudulent transaction. I had also quietly submitted a formal whistleblower report to the federal database, ensuring that the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had early access to the encrypted digital files. I was not walking into this courtroom to fight over a small condo. I was walking in to trigger a massive federal avalanche. I had planted a bomb directly under their feet, and they were willingly dancing on the trigger, completely oblivious to the countdown. I walked into the courtroom and sat down at the empty defense table, pulling my chair in close, looking small and isolated on the other side of the room. The plaintiff table was crowded with Vivian, Preston, Chanel, and their team of ruthless corporate sharks. They were laughing quietly, passing notes and pointing at me like I was a pathetic joke. Their arrogance was so massive it completely blinded them to the reality of the room. They were so focused on crushing my small life that they never bothered to look up and see the massive legal anvil hanging by a very thin thread directly over their own heads. I opened my cheap plastic folder and stared at the top sheet of paper. It was a printed copy of the IRS tax evasion notice that Preston had hidden from my mother, the proof that she was currently the CEO of a $40 million debt bomb. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, clinical calm of an auditor taking over my entire body. The tears and the trembling vanished entirely, replaced by a quiet, lethal focus. I was ready to let them dig their own graves right here, under oath, where the lies they told would become the very chains that locked them away forever. The heavy wooden doors beside the bench swung open, and Judge Crawford walked into the courtroom, her black robe billowing slightly as she took her seat at the high bench. She was an older woman, with stern eyes and a reputation for moving cases, along with brutal efficiency. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and we all stood up before taking our seats again. The air in the room felt incredibly thick, suffocating under the heavy weight of the massive lies my family was about to tell under oath. I kept my head down, staring blindly at my cheap plastic folder, letting my shoulders slump forward, playing the part of the defeated broken daughter perfectly. Across the center aisle, my mother Vivian was putting on an absolute masterclass in high society theatrical manipulation. She was dressed in head-to-toe custom couture, wearing a sleek black designer morning suit that probably cost more than my entire car. Thick diamond earrings sparkled aggressively under the harsh fluorescent courtroom lights, catching the attention of everyone in the room. She had deliberately chosen an outfit that screamed tragic mourning, but also radiated elite high society wealth. She sat perfectly straight, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief in her perfectly manicured hands, before the judge even spoke a single word. Vivian began to produce fake crocodile tears, dabbing at her eyes with practiced dramatic elegance, sniffing softly to ensure the judge noticed her profound manufactured grief. Preston sat right behind her in the front row of the gallery, his legs crossed comfortably at the knee. He was wearing a sharp, tailored, imported navy suit, his expensive watch catching the light every time he moved his wrist. He looked incredibly smug, completely relaxed, like he was watching a mildly entertaining television show rather than a legal proceeding designed to strip his sister-in-law of her only home. Chanel sat next to him, wearing dark designer sunglasses indoors, resting her head on his shoulder, playing the part of the exhausted, traumatized sister standing bravely by her devastated mother. The judge looked over the initial legal filings and nodded toward Vivian's attorney, Mr. Harrington. A slick, high-priced corporate litigator stood up from his expensive leather chair and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked slowly to the center of the room, commanding the space with his aggressive, confident posture. He cleared his throat and began to paint the most disgusting fabricated picture of my life I had ever heard. "Your Honor." Mr. Harrington began, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "We are here today to rectify a tragic manipulation of a vulnerable dying man. My client, Vivian, is a heartbroken, grieving daughter who just lost her beloved father, the patriarch of their prominent Atlanta family. Instead of mourning peacefully, she has been forced into this courtroom to protect her father's legacy from the very person who maliciously exploited his declining mental state in his final years." Vivian let out a loud theatrical sob, burying her face deep into her lace handkerchief. The judge looked at her with deep, genuine sympathy, then turned a cold, harsh glare toward me. I bit the inside of my cheek, using the physical pain to keep myself from smiling. They were digging the hole so incredibly deep that there would be absolutely no way for them to ever climb out once the federal dirt started falling. Mr. Harrington paced back and forth across the polished floor, his voice rising with dramatic indignation. He described my grandfather, Elijah, as a confused, fragile old man suffering from severe, early-onset dementia. A complete lie that made my blood boil. My grandfather was a brilliant logistics billionaire who remained sharper than a razor until his very last breath. But Mr. Harrington continued weaving his toxic fairy tale, claiming that I had preyed on my grandfather's confusion, isolating him from his loving daughter Vivian and tricking him into purchasing a downtown condo for me to live in rent-free. The condo was a massive financial drain on the estate, Mr. Harrington argued, waving a stack of fabricated medical documents in the air. Brielle took advantage of her own grandfather's failing mind to secure luxury real estate while contributing absolutely nothing to the family business. My client Vivian, as the sole rightful heir and acting CEO of the logistics empire, is simply asking the court to reverse this fraudulent gift and return the stolen asset to the primary estate where it legally belongs. Preston leaned forward in his gallery seat, a vicious, victorious smirk playing on his lips. He caught my eye and tilted his head slightly, mocking me from across the room. His malicious intent was incredibly clear. He thought he had completely won. He thought I was drowning, and he was standing safely on the shore, watching me sink into absolute nothingness. Mr. Harrington turned his aggressive focus entirely onto me. The cross-examination phase of his performance, beginning with a ruthless character assassination. "Your Honor, let us look at the character of the defendant sitting before us today," Mr. Harrington said, pointing a sharp accusing finger in my direction. Brielle claims to be an independent financial auditor, but the court should know that she was recently terminated from her prestigious firm for gross professional misconduct. My mother had given him all the ammunition Preston had entirely fabricated. Mr. Harrington told the judge about the false allegations of data leaking, using my recent termination as concrete proof that I was a dishonest, manipulative criminal. He brought up the vicious rumors my mother had spread through the elite church circles, stating that I was completely ostracized by my community because of my wicked, ungrateful behavior. He painted me as a desperate, broke outcast who would do absolutely anything to maintain a free roof over my head, including stealing from a dying relative. I sat perfectly still, letting him hurl lie after lie at my silent form. When I took the stand to answer his vicious questions, I kept my responses short and deliberately unconvincing. I stuttered slightly, looking down at my scuffed shoes, acting like a woman who knew she was completely defeated. I offered no massive legal defense, no aggressive counter-arguments. I just weakly stated that my grandfather gave me the condo because he loved me, and that I did not steal anything. Mr. Harrington tore my weak defense to absolute shreds within seconds. He belittled me, mocked my lack of legal representation, and dismissed my statement as the pathetic excuses of a desperate thief. The judge listened intently, her face hardening with every passing moment. She saw a disheveled, unemployed woman in a cheap, wrinkled cardigan sitting alone at the defense table, without even a lawyer to speak for her. In the judge's mind, Mr. Harrington's story made perfect, logical sense. A failed, desperate daughter stealing from a wealthy, sick grandfather was a classic courtroom narrative that she saw every single day. Vivian took the stand to give her sworn testimony, and her performance was nothing short of breathtaking. She cried. She trembled. She spoke in a soft, broken voice about how much she loved her father and how deeply it hurt her to see me. Taking advantage of his foggy mind, she lied under oath with such practiced, flawless ease that it was genuinely terrifying to witness. She swore to the court that she was only pursuing this lawsuit to honor her father's true wishes and protect the family legacy from my greedy hands. Preston actually laughed out loud from the gallery. A short, cruel sound of pure amusement when I stumbled over a question. The judge did not even reprimand him. The entire room was completely against me, aligned perfectly with the wealthy, glamorous, grieving mother and her polished legal team. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their expensive suits that they did not realize they had just sworn on the federal record that Vivian was the absolute sole owner of the entire estate, taking full legal responsibility for everything attached to it. Mr. Harrington confidently rested his case, returning to his seat next to my weeping mother. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Judge Crawford arranged her papers, tapping her pen against the heavy wooden block on her desk. She looked down at me, her expression hardening into absolute, unforgiving judgment. The air in the room was thick and silent, waiting for the final, devastating blow to fall. "I have reviewed the filings and heard the testimony presented today." The judge began, her voice echoing with stern finality. "The evidence provided by the plaintiff regarding the deceased's mental state and the highly suspicious nature of the property transfer is substantial. Furthermore, the defendant's lack of credible evidence and her recent history of professional misconduct severely undermines her credibility in this courtroom." Vivian squeezed Mr. Harrington's hand, her crocodile tears magically drying up as a triumphant gleam appeared in her eyes. Chanel sat up straight, pulling off her designer sunglasses to watch my absolute destruction with clear, unobstructed vision. Preston leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head, completely relaxed, basking in the total victory he had orchestrated from the shadows he had successfully crushed. The only person who could expose his massive fraud, leaving him free to steal millions. The judge picked up her heavy wooden gavel, holding it in the air, ready to bring it down and finalize my eviction. "It is the ruling of this court that the property deed transfer is hereby revoked," she announced loudly, "and the condo will immediately revert back to the primary estate." Before the judge's wooden gavel could strike the sounding block and finalize their victory, a massive noise shattered the quiet tension of the room. The heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a loud, echoing bang. Every single head in the room snapped around to see what was happening. Vivian gasped, turning in her seat while Preston dropped his arms, his smug smile freezing on his face. Lawyer Hayes, my grandfather's most trusted personal attorney, strode purposefully down the center aisle of the courtroom. His presence was commanding his face, a mask of absolute serious authority. But he was not walking alone. Flanking him on either side, were two tall, imposing men wearing dark, formal suits and displaying the unmistakable gold badges of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents clipped to their belts. The entire courtroom fell into a shocked, breathless silence. Vivian's triumphant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Preston turned pale, staring at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes, his polished Wall Street composure cracking in real time. The heavy quiet in the room felt like the air before a massive violent storm. Lawyer Hayes did not stop walking until he reached the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the legal tables. He looked directly at the judge, completely ignoring my mother and her highly paid corporate lawyer. The FBI agents stood silently behind him, their hands resting near their belts, scanning the room with cold, calculating eyes. "I deeply apologize for the sudden interruption, Your Honor," Lawyer Hayes announced, his deep voice projecting clearly across the stunned room. "But I am executing a legally binding directive that overrides these current proceedings." Judge Crawford lowered her gavel, frowning in confusion at the sudden appearance of federal agents in her civil courtroom. "What is the meaning of this?" "Mr. Hayes," she demanded, "you cannot simply disrupt a ruling without severe legal justification." "I have severe legal justification, Your Honor," Lawyer Hayes replied. Stepping through the wooden gate and approaching the bench, he reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy document sealed with dark red wax, stamped with my grandfather's personal signet ring. "Your Honor, I have newly discovered evidence from the deceased, Elijah James Lawyer Hayes," declared, his voice ringing with absolute undeniable authority. Mr. Harrington jumped up from his seat looking frantic. "Objection. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The estate is settled, and my client is the sole executor. Whatever documents Mr. Hayes has are irrelevant to this specific property dispute." "We are in the middle of a ruling, lawyer." Hayes turned slowly to look at my mother and Preston, a cold, devastating certainty in his eyes. The trap was fully sprung and the massive steel jaws were about to slam shut forever. "They are entirely relevant." "Mr. Harrington, lawyer," Hayes countered, turning back to the judge, "because this evidence was authorized to be unsealed exclusively and only in the specific event that Vivian sued Brielle." Judge Crawford stared at the heavy red wax seal on the document, her stern expression shifting into one of deep, profound curiosity. She looked from Lawyer Hayes to my mother, who was now gripping the edge of the plaintiff table with white-knuckled panic. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Mr. Harrington tried to protest again, sputtering about procedure and estate law, but Judge Crawford silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand. She reached forward and accepted the thick envelope from Lawyer Hayes, her fingers breaking the dark red wax seal with a loud, distinct crack that echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom. She unfolded the thick parchment paper, adjusting her reading glasses. The room was so incredibly quiet, I could hear the frantic, ragged breathing of my sister Chanel sitting in the gallery. Judge Crawford cleared her throat and began to read my grandfather's final words out loud into the federal record. To my eldest daughter, Vivian, the judge read, her voice projecting clearly across the paralyzed room. "If you are sitting in a courtroom right now hearing these specific words read aloud, it means my worst fears about you have been entirely realized. It means that your blind greed has completely consumed you, and you have officially attempted to use the legal system to strip your own niece Brielle of the one single modest gift I gave her to keep her safe." My mother let out a small, choked gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. Mr. Harrington looked completely terrified, staring at the paper in the judge's hands, as if it were a live grenade that was about to obliterate his entire legal career. The two FBI agents standing behind Lawyer Hayes remained perfectly still, their eyes locked onto Preston, who was beginning to sweat profusely in the gallery. The judge did not pause to allow my mother to recover. She continued reading the devastating letter, her tone turning sharp and condemning. "You spent your entire life obsessed with high society status, Vivian. You worshipped appearances above integrity, and you threw your own flesh and blood out into the freezing rain because she did not fit into your shallow, superficial world. But your greatest failure, the most pathetic mistake you ever made, was your absolute blind worship of Preston's supposed finance pedigree. You handed him the keys to my kingdom because he wore an expensive imported suit and spoke with the unearned arrogance of a white Wall Street hotshot. You thought he was the ultimate prize for our family, a shiny trophy husband to elevate your social standing. Preston shifted violently in his seat in the gallery, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. He looked around the room, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, but the federal agents blocked the only exit. He looked like a trapped animal, his polished Wall Street composure melting off his face like cheap wax. Chanel sat next to him, her mouth hanging slightly open as the golden illusion of her perfect wealthy marriage began to crack. But I am not a fool. Vivian the judge read my grandfather's words, striking like physical blows across the quiet room. I built my logistics empire from the dirt up, fighting off real predators in a world that wanted to see men like me fail, and I recognized a cheap parasite the exact moment he walked into my house. I knew Preston was draining my company 2 years ago. I watched him set up his highly encrypted offshore accounts. I watched him bleed the corporate liquidity dry, and I watched him forge your names on dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands. Chanel let out a piercing, horrified shriek from the gallery, turning to stare at her husband with wide, terrified eyes. "What is she talking about?" Preston Chanel cried out, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "What dummy corporations?" Preston did not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the judge, his chest heaving as the digital walls of his flawless financial fortress completely collapsed around him, exposing him to the harsh light of a federal courtroom. "Order in this court?" Judge Crawford snapped, slamming her wooden gavel down hard onto the sounding block before turning her eyes back to the devastating letter in her hands. "You allowed a common thief to rob us blind. Vivian," the letter continued, "because you were too arrogant and too willfully ignorant to ever look at a single balance sheet. You hated auditing. You hated the hard, boring, meticulous work that Brielle dedicated her entire life to mastering. And because of your arrogant stupidity, you played right into his pathetic little hands. You were perfectly positioned to take the absolute monumental fall for his federal crimes." I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my cheap plastic folder resting in front of me. I did not slouch anymore. I sat up straight, rolling my shoulders back, looking directly at my mother, as the absolute magnitude of her disastrous choices finally crashed down upon her. She looked physically sick, her glamorous black morning couture suddenly looking like a ridiculous Halloween costume. She was trembling so violently her heavy diamond earrings shook, casting fractured light across her terrified face. Judge Crawford flipped to the second page of the thick parchment, her eyes scanning the next paragraph before she read it aloud. I could see the exact moment the judge realized the sheer monumental scale of the financial trap my grandfather had laid. Her eyebrows shot up in pure disbelief, a flicker of professional awe crossing her stern features before she composed herself and continued reading the final testament of a self-made billionaire. "You eagerly signed the inheritance papers 3 weeks ago." Vivian the judge read, her voice ringing with absolute finality, striking like a hammer blow against my mother's fragile ego. "You were so desperate to claim your throne as the new chief executive officer, so desperate to parade your newfound wealth in front of your wealthy elite church friends that you accepted the entire primary estate without demanding a single independent audit. You signed the legally binding transfer documents in front of my lawyers, sealing your fate completely." Mr. Harrington dropped his expensive fountain pen onto the table, the metal clicking loudly in the dead silence. He rubbed his temples, letting out a long, heavy sigh, looking like a man who knew his client was completely beyond saving. In the corporate legal world, signing an inheritance transfer of a massive corporation without conducting due diligence was an act of supreme, irreversible stupidity. "Congratulations, Vivian." The judge continued reading the cold, calculated words of a man who refused to be defeated even in death. "You now legally own a completely hollowed-out corporation." Preston drained every single cent of actual operational liquidity and leveraged the physical assets to the absolute breaking point. The $40 million logistics empire you inherited is currently carrying exactly $40 million in massive federal tax debt and defaulted commercial loans, Because you blindly signed the papers, you pierced the corporate veil. You are the sole registered owner, the acting CEO, and the primary target of an active secret investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. My mother let out a horrific guttural scream. She collapsed forward onto the heavy wooden plaintiff table, tearing at her perfectly styled hair, her diamond rings scratching against the polished wood. "It is a lie," she shrieked, looking wildly at Mr. Harrington, her eyes bulging with pure terror. "Do something. He is lying. It is my company. It is my money. Tell them it belongs to me." "Sit down and remain silent, Mom, or I will have you removed and held in contempt," Judge Crawford demanded, glaring at Vivian until she slumped back into her leather chair, sobbing hysterically into her hands. Her flawless makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. In the gallery, Preston was actively hyperventilating, gripping the wooden bench in front of him so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths as the federal agents took a slow, deliberate step toward the gallery seating. The judge looked back down at the letter, reading the final, devastating paragraph that would forever change the destiny of our family. "While you and Preston were busy picking the bones of my dying company, I was busy protecting my real legacy. I quietly liquidated every single clean core asset I owned over the last 18 months. I sold the private real estate holdings, the untouched overseas investments, and the clean operational capital. I moved exactly $80 million in pure, untraceable liquid cash into a legally fortified foreign blind trust completely protected from the IRS, the corporate debt, and the grubby hands of greedy thieves." The entire courtroom gasped simultaneously. $80 million. The massive number hung in the air like a glittering diamond, reflecting the absolute pure genius of my grandfather's final move. He had intentionally let Preston steal the rotten fruit while he quietly harvested the entire healthy orchard right under their arrogant, ignorant noses. He had engineered the ultimate white-collar bait and switch, leaving them holding a ticking federal debt bomb while securing his true wealth in an impenetrable offshore vault. The judge read the very last sentence of the letter, her eyes flicking up from the page to look directly at me, sitting quietly at the empty defense table. "And the sole executor and total beneficiary of that $80 million blind trust." The judge read her voice, echoing in the stunned, breathless silence of the courtroom, "Is my brilliant, hardworking granddaughter Brielle, because she is the only person in this entire bloodline who actually knows how to protect the numbers." The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the large room. I sat there looking at the stunned faces of the judge, the FBI agents, and the highly paid corporate lawyers. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply closed my cheap plastic folder, resting my hands neatly on top of it. My grandfather had given me the ultimate weapon, and he had set the perfect public stage for me to execute his final, flawless judgment. He knew they would try to crush me, and he gave me the exact tool required to completely obliterate their entire existence. Vivian slowly turned her head to look at me, her face a mask of absolute ruined despair. She looked like a broken, shattered shell of a human being, the reality of her monumental stupidity finally crushing her fragile high society ego into fine dust. She owed the federal government $40 million, and her despised outcast daughter, the one she called a boring failure, was now the sole controller of an $80 million untouchable fortune. She had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Her country club friends would abandon her. Her church circle would cast her out, and the federal government was coming to seize whatever pathetic scraps she had left. Chanel was openly weeping in the gallery, pushing Preston violently away from her as he tried to grab her arm to quiet her down. "Do not touch me, you criminal!" she screamed at him, slapping his hand away, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "You ruined us! You stole everything, and you framed us! You sociopath! You set me up!" Preston backed away from her, holding his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. But there was nowhere left for him to run. Lawyer Hayes stepped forward, breaking the tense, heavy silence. He handed a separate, thick stack of documents directly to the judge. "Your Honor, These are the certified bank records, the offshore shell company registrations, and the Internal Revenue Service audit files. They completely corroborate every single word written in Elijah James' final letter. Furthermore, the defendant Brielle has already submitted the decrypted digital files to the Federal Bureau of Investigation detailing the exact wire fraud scheme orchestrated by Preston. The judge looked over the documents, her face pale with shock. The sheer magnitude of the white-collar crime sitting on her desk was entirely unprecedented. She looked down at Vivian, who was rocking back and forth in her chair, completely unresponsive to the chaotic reality collapsing around her. Then the judge looked at me, a deep look of profound respect crossing her stern features. I had walked into her courtroom looking like a completely defenseless victim, representing myself pro se without a single lawyer to protect me. But I had just single-handedly dismantled a multi-million-dollar federal fraud ring using nothing but an old briefcase and my auditing skills. I looked back at Preston in the gallery. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with absolute pure, unadulterated terror. The smug, arrogant, white-collar broker who threw $100 bill at my feet and told me to go back to my miserable apartment finally realized that the quiet, boring auditor he had mocked and discarded was the exact person who had just locked the heavy steel door to his federal prison cell. The ultimate payoff had been delivered perfectly, and the fragile house of cards they had built on my grandfather's back was now officially burned to the ground, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. Preston realized it was entirely over. His smug, arrogant Wall Street facade completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic, desperate reality of a trapped, cornered rat. The two federal agents standing near the gallery wooden divider had not moved, but their eyes were locked dead onto his chest, waiting for the inevitable mistake. Preston made his choice. He shoved Chanel violently out of his way, causing her to stumble backward and crash hard against the heavy wooden bench. Behind them, he spun around and sprinted frantically down the center aisle of the courtroom, his expensive imported leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. It was an incredibly stupid, futile move. The federal agents moved with terrifying, lightning-fast precision. The agent on the left stepped seamlessly into the aisle, planting his feet wide, dropping his shoulders slightly. Preston crashed full speed into the agent, completely stopped in his tracks by the heavy, unmovable force. The second agent swept in from the right, grabbing Preston's expensive tailored jacket and spinning him forcefully around, slamming him face first against the thick wooden double. Doors at the back of the courtroom, the harsh, heavy sound of flesh hitting solid oak, echoed like a gunshot through the silent, paralyzed room. "Preston Stevenson, you are under federal arrest," the leading agent announced, his voice loud and completely devoid of any emotion. "You are being charged with multi-million-dollar wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, money laundering, and federal tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." Preston let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine as the agent pulled his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy federal handcuffs, snapping shut around his wrists, cut through the heavy silence of the room. Preston writhed against the door, trying to twist his head around to look at the judge. "This is a mistake," he screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror. "I am a licensed broker. I am a prominent financial consultant." Vivian signed the papers. It was her company. She authorized the transfers. "Shut up, Preston," the agent ordered, shoving him firmly against the heavy wood, the evidence provided by the primary auditor. Brielle James via the federal whistleblower database contains your explicit digital fingerprints on every single offshore shell company transfer. We have the IP logs from your private home office. The Internal Revenue Service has already frozen every single Cayman Island account registered under your wife's name. You are done. The words hit the gallery like a physical shockwave. Chanel, who had managed to pull herself up from the wooden bench, let out a horrific, piercing scream. "Preston, what did you do?" she shrieked, stumbling forward, her designer sunglasses falling to the floor and shattering. She looked from her handcuffed husband to the cold, indifferent faces of the federal agents. "What shell companies? Preston, where is our money? What did you do to my accounts?" Preston did not even look at her. He just kept babbling frantically, trying to shift the blame, trying to find any possible angle of escape. But the federal agents ignored him completely, yanking him backward and dragging him roughly out through the heavy double doors of the courtroom. The doors swung shut behind them, cutting off Preston's pathetic, desperate pleas, leaving behind a room that was fundamentally permanently altered. Chanel stood in the center aisle staring blankly at the closed oak doors, her hands trembling violently, the golden illusion of her perfect, wealthy, high society. Marriage had just been completely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. Her successful, brilliant Wall Street husband was actually a massive federal felon, and the federal agents had just stated loudly for the public record that the stolen offshore money was hidden in accounts registered under her own name. She realized with terrifying, absolute clarity that she was completely, entirely penniless. The luxury cars, the exotic Hawaiian vacations, the designer handbags, every single thing she owned was purchased with stolen federal money, and the IRS was going to seize absolutely everything. She swayed heavily on her feet, her eyes rolling backward into her head, and she collapsed completely, fainting dead away onto the hard, polished courtroom floor. Vivian did not rush to help her favorite golden daughter. Vivian did not even look at Chanel laying unconscious in the aisle. My mother was entirely consumed by the monumental, catastrophic reality of her own complete destruction. She slowly slid off her leather chair, dropping heavily onto her knees on the floor of the courtroom. The expensive black mourning couture she wore was suddenly deeply tragically ironic. She looked up at the high bench, her face a ruined mask of absolute horror and grief. "It was all mine," Vivian screamed at the judge, her voice raw and utterly broken. Tearing through her throat, she slammed her fists repeatedly against the heavy wooden leg of the plaintiff table, the loud thuds echoing sharply in the large room. "He was my father. It belongs to me. I am his eldest daughter. I am his flesh and blood. It was all supposed to be mine." Judge Crawford looked down at the pathetic, desperate woman kneeling on the floor, the judge's stern face completely empty of any sympathy or compassion. The legal system did not care about high society status or prestigious country club memberships. The legal system only cared about the cold, hard, undeniable reality of the signed documents and the massive federal tax codes. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel, holding it tightly in her hand. "You signed the inheritance transfer documents entirely, of your own free will." "Ma'am Judge," Crawford declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality across the chaotic courtroom, "you legally accepted the role of Chief Executive Officer without demanding a single independent financial audit. You willingly accepted full legal and financial responsibility for the entire corporate entity." Vivian shook her head violently, tears streaming down her ruined face. "No," she sobbed, holding her hands up toward the bench as if she could physically catch the words before they struck her. "I did not know what Preston was doing. I did not know the company was in debt. It is not fair. I am the victim here. He tricked me." "Ignorance of the law is not a valid legal defense, ma'am," the judge stated coldly, bringing the heavy wooden gavel down hard against the sounding block. The sharp, loud crack finalized the absolute destruction of my mother's entire existence. The Internal Revenue Service does not care if you were tricked. They care that you are the sole registered owner of a corporate entity that currently owes them $40 million in unpaid federal taxes and penalties the court finds entirely in favor of the defendant Brielle James. The civil suit to revoke the property deed is officially dismissed with prejudice." Vivian let out a low, agonizing moan, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into her expensive lace handkerchief. She was utterly, completely ruined. The federal government would seize the massive Buckhead estate they would take. The luxury cars, freeze the domestic bank accounts, and auction off every single piece of expensive jewelry she owned to satisfy the massive, crushing tax debt. She would be left with absolutely nothing. The wealthy elite friends she spent her entire life trying to impress would immediately cast her out, pretending they never even knew her name. She would become the ultimate high society cautionary tale, A pathetic punchline whispered about at elegant dinner parties. I sat perfectly still at the defense table looking down at the woman who had birthed me, who had raised me and who had ultimately thrown me out into the freezing rain. I felt absolutely nothing. No vindictive triumph, no overwhelming sadness, no lingering anger. I just felt completely, utterly unfazed. The fire of their toxicity had completely burned itself out, leaving nothing behind but cold gray ash. I slowly closed my cheap plastic folder, picked it up from the heavy wooden table, and stood up ready to walk out of the courtroom and into my new life, leaving their spectacular self-inflicted ruins entirely behind me. I walked past the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, leaving the chaotic, sobbing wreckage of my mother entirely behind me. My cheap, scuffed shoes clicked steadily against the marble floor as I made my way down the wide corridor toward the main exit. The heavy glass doors of the courthouse slid open automatically, welcoming me with a rush of bright Atlanta sunlight. I stepped out onto the wide concrete steps. For the very first time in my life, I felt completely weightless, entirely free from those crushing toxic expectations that had chained me down since childhood. But before I could reach the bottom of the steps, I heard the frantic, desperate clicking of heels behind me. "Brielle, please wait," a ruined, broken voice called out. I stopped and turned slowly. Vivian had chased after me right at my feet, her expensive black morning dress tearing against stone. She grabbed my ankle with both of her shaking hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "Please do not leave me," she sobbed, her mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her pale face. "We are family, Brielle. You are my daughter. You have to help me. They are going to take everything." I calmly reached down and gently peeled her desperate, clutching fingers off my ankle. I looked down at her not with anger or malice, but with absolute cold finality. "Blood does not make a family mother," I said quietly, letting her hands drop back onto the cold stone steps. "Respect does." I turned my back on her and walked away into the bright, warm Atlanta sun, leaving her kneeling in the shadows of her own monumental destruction. Exactly 12 months have passed since that defining morning on the courthouse steps. The fall of their fragile glass empire was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. The federal justice system does not care about your high society, country club memberships, or how many elite church galas you have hosted. Preston was formally convicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and severe corporate embezzlement. The judge showed absolutely zero leniency toward his arrogant Wall Street attitude. He is currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his tailored suits and his smug, entitled grin. His prestigious finance network abandoned him. The exact second the handcuffs clicked shut, pretending they never even knew his name, Chanel was utterly destroyed by the fallout. Her massive offshore accounts were entirely seized by the Internal Revenue Service, leaving her completely penniless and socially radioactive. The elite friends she used to flaunt her stolen wealth with immediately turned their backs on her. She was forced to sell every single designer handbag and luxury piece of jewelry just to pay off her mounting legal fees. She now works a grueling minimum-wage retail job at a local department store, folding clothes for the very same wealthy women she used to aggressively look down upon. Vivian and Charles were completely bankrupted by the crushing $40 million federal tax debt. The government seized the massive Buckhead estate, the luxury imported cars, and every single domestic bank account they had to their names. They were officially evicted from the mansion and forced to move into a tiny rundown motel on the absolute worst side of the city they live in. Constant poverty, entirely consumed by the bitter, toxic resentment of their own catastrophic choices. They have absolutely nothing left but each other and the terrible, suffocating weight of their monumental failures. Meanwhile, my life has completely blossomed into something more beautiful and profound than I ever could have possibly imagined. My grandfather's $80 million blind trust was successfully transferred into my full legal control without a single complication. I did not use the incredible wealth to buy flashy sports cars or massive empty mansions to show off to strangers. I used it to honor the remarkable man who always saw my true worth. I established the Elijah James Foundational Trust, a massive nonprofit organization dedicated exclusively to funding full-ride academic scholarships for young, driven African American women pursuing advanced degrees in finance and corporate auditing. We provide them with the resources, the mentorship, and the impenetrable support network they need to succeed in a ruthless industry that constantly tries to shut them out. I sit in my bright corner office every single day, completely surrounded by brilliant, hardworking young women who are building their own independent empires, knowing that my grandfather is looking down on us with absolute, pure, unadulterated pride. The greatest and most powerful lesson I ever learned from this entire ordeal was that true ultimate security never comes from seeking validation from toxic people, even if those people happen to share your bloodline. For my entire life, I was told that my quiet dedication and my independent professional ambition made me a massive disappointing failure to the family legacy. They tried to manipulate me, belittle me, and ultimately destroy my existence to protect their stolen, fragile wealth. But their vicious cruelty only forged me into an absolutely unbreakable force. Setting firm, non-negotiable boundaries with abusive family members is not a sign of weakness or betrayal. It is the ultimate act of profound self-love. You are never obligated to set yourself entirely on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, to guard your hard-earned success, and to walk away from anyone who refuses to respect your basic human dignity. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace and preserve your sanity? Share your story in the comments below. You are never alone in your struggle. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about surviving betrayal and completely reclaiming your power. Thank you so much for listening to my journey, and always remember that your true worth is absolutely non-negotiable. The greatest lesson from this journey is that sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to disrespect or exploit you. True family is built on mutual respect, not toxic obligations or shallow appearances. When people repeatedly show you their greed and cruelty, believe them and step away. Setting firm boundaries is never an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate expression of love for yourself. You simply cannot heal in the exact same environment that completely broke you. Reclaiming your power means having the courage to build your own independent empire. Please like, subscribe, and share your story below.